Okay, so this is what I'm thinking about the peace in a Christian or in a theological understanding. Okay, so from the New Testament, when we are talking about the reconciliation, it is not just a matter on a personal level. For instance, like we have hatred with one another, or we have dispute with one another. Reconciliation is not just bring these two peoples or a few individuals to come together, but it can also be understood institutionally. In other words, how can the institute or the structures of society can promote such kind of reconciliation with one another? I don't know what happened in the Philippines, in North Korea, in Japan. For instance, like in the last few years in Hong Kong, we are giving attention to the issues of legislation on the issue of discrimination. Okay, discrimination against the homosexuals people, discrimination against the disabled people, and also the gender issues as well. So when we are talking about peace, we are not just only concerned about the personal level, but we also have to pay attention on the structural, on the policy. How can such kind of policy and structure promote a kind of reconciliation, understanding with one another? And we do know that it is not just enough to talk about the institutional level, because without education, without transformation of our hearts, even though we can follow all such kind of rules and regulations and even policy, but it cannot make any real radical change. So on one hand, it is important to have the institutional change, but we also have to pay attention on the individual change. So this is what I'm thinking about peace. Okay. Now, what I'm trying to say, and the second part that what I'm trying to share with you, that when we are talking about peace, most of the time, we also associate the idea of peace with the issue of non-violence. Okay. Well, perhaps maybe in Hong Kong it is, we can say we have a different kind of violence, verbal violence. But in some parts of the world, for instance, like in the Philippines, as far as I know, when you are talking about the violence, that is a kind of physical violence, a lot of war, something like that has happened there, even though in Indonesia, in Malaysia as well, So when we are talking about peace, most of the time it is always associated with the idea of non-violence. Now my concern here is, can violence be a possible way leading to peace? Well, you may say no, but in some of the context, the situation is very, very different with ours. Well, I do not have an answer, but I just want to raise the issue as well. Or we may also ask in a different way, can peace allow violence? Okay, so such kind of thing. Well, maybe in some of the contexts, from where you come from, this is also the issue of what I'm trying to say here. It is not just enough to talk about the peace in a very abstract way, but when peace is something related to violence, and justice, how can we deal with these issues? Okay. Now, what I'm trying to say in the coming 20 minutes onwards, I will focus my sharing on the issue on peace and non-violence. Okay, so that it may be more concrete in a sense instead of a very general understanding of the theology of peace. Okay. Now, when we are talking about the non-violence, I do not know which particular scripture or passage that you have in your mind. Anything coming from the Bible when we are talking about the violence, about the peace? I think one striking passage come to my mind is coming from the Sermon on the Mount. When Jesus said, love your enemies. I think this is exactly something very challenging our usual way of thinking, because Jesus is very clear that we have enemies. There are enemies there. From different religious traditions, they may have different understanding of enemies. Well, I do not know how many of you coming from the Buddhist background. I'm not saying that you are the Buddhist, but maybe your country has a very strong culture and tradition of Buddhism, of Buddhism. Well, according to the Buddhist understanding, they do not have any idea of enemies. Now, for the Christian, Jesus is very clear, saying that we have enemies. Therefore, we have to learn to how to live with the enemy. That is to love your enemies. But for the Buddhist understanding, well, we should not have any idea of enemies, because the idea of enemies is something created by our own, because we are to engage in something. Because according to the Buddhist understanding, the highest achievement of a person is to be the non-self, anatta. Without non-self, okay, anatta. That means being a person in a anatta stage, we are not engaged in anything. Okay, if we do not care what is happening, and we do not care what other people treat me, then there are no enemies. So enemies are something that we create for our own. So the best way for the Buddhist understanding is not to love your enemy, but rather to think, why do you have the idea of enemy in your mind? So this is the problem. So there is a different understanding. Now, I'm not saying that whether the Buddhist understanding is right or wrong, but what I'm trying to say here is there are two different ways of understanding of enemies. For the Christian understanding, we are sure there are enemies in our lives. So we learn how to deal with the enemies. That is to love them. But for the Buddhists, you do not need to love the enemies. The point is, why they become your enemies? So it is your problem, not the problem coming from the enemies. So I do not know whether this sounds something very different in your context, especially in maybe in some of your countries when the people, they are persecuted, not only by the government, but by other people. Then you will say, they are not my enemies because of me. I create the enemies. Instead of saying that, well, I have to love them, I have to learn how to deal with them. I just give you a very simple examples here. Now, perhaps I also have to mention that for the Buddhist understanding, they also emphasize on the idea of karma. Okay, karma. That is the law of causation. Or because I have done something wrong, there is something bad in my life. That is the idea of karma. So perhaps maybe the idea of karma can help the Buddhists to deal with the issue of enemies. But at the same time, you also have to pay a price, because when you have encountered something bad in your life, you just say, because of my karma, because of my last generation, it's not good. So that's why I face a lot of misfortune in my life. So that is to say, what I can do is just to wait something to be changed instead of facing the problem. So I just want to let you know something about this, because I know some of you come from the Asian context, and the Buddhist way of thinking do play a very important role in your daily life here. Okay. So what I'm trying to say here, when Jesus said, or request us to love our enemies, Jesus we are asked to forgive or to love them instead of to forget them. Okay. If we forget them, how do you love your enemies? Okay. Because he or she is no longer there. So even though a theologian coming from the former Yugoslavia, he has written a book saying that forget, not just forgive. Because most of the time we Christians emphasize that we have to forgive, not forget. But what I'm trying to emphasize here, when Jesus said we are asked to love, then we can't forget. Otherwise, there's no person or no particular person that we have to show our love. So it is not something related to forget, but something related to something else. Okay, just give you an examples here. Now, but in reality, we find that it is so difficult to put Jesus' teaching into practice, to love your enemies. Well, it may be possible in a personal level, but it is so hard in an institutional level. We may love someone who has done something bad in my life, okay. But if it is a government, if it is a structure, then so we find it is so hard, because we always know that it is easier for an individual